Welcome to 4 Quarter Lives, a podcast exploring the profound impact of longer lives and careers on everything: countries, companies, couples, and careers. I'm Avivah Wittenberg-Cox, and on this week's 4 Quarter Lives, I talk with Kate Schaefers and Simon Chan, the co-chairs of Nexel, the Nexel Collaborative. Nexel is a non-profit alliance of higher education leaders advancing midlife and later life learning. It connects universities building encore programs for adults in transition, sharing models, research, and know-how to help institutions design financially sustainable, mission-consistent offerings that renew purpose, build community, integrate wellness, and foster intergenerational engagement. Almost all the universities that have been on this podcast series are part of the Nexel network and have learned from it. This conversation closes our Higher Ed Meets Longevity series, where we've toured the pioneering campuses reimagining education for a 5-generation world, from fellowships and mentorships to Ollies and university-based retirement communities. With Kate Schaefers and Simon Chan, we zoom out to the ecosystem level, why this isn't a boutique niche, but a core strategy for universities facing enrollment cliffs, talent shortages, and the realities of 100-year lives, and how Nexel's growing network is accelerating what's next in universities all over the world. Stay with us as we wrap up the series by looking ahead, what a truly age-diverse campus could be and what it will take to get there. So welcome, Kate Schaefers and Simon Chan, to 4 Quarter Lives. Really delighted to have you both with me.
I've been following the podcast for a long time, so excited to be here.
Thank you. And I've been following all the work that you've been doing on this passion we share for figuring out how higher ed is going to meet the longevity challenge. So both of you, I'm excited to have you because, and this is actually the concluding podcast to our series, where we've been interviewing the directors of all these different programs in universities that are beginning to look at this longevity phenomenon. You both have been watching this wave of programs develop. So from Harvard, Stanford to Cambridge and Singapore are the latest couple to start. I'm curious maybe to start, if you were both sitting across from a university president or provost today, what's the single most important message you'd want them to hear about why midlife and later life learning is so important to their university strategies?
I think I'd start off by saying that the midlife programs that you talked about are just a signal, right? I think it's a signal of a broader movement and a greater change that's happening in higher ed. And I would emphasize that this is really something that can be core to their strategy, not something niche that sits on the side, but something that's core to their strategy to create financial sustainability, which are all presidents and provosts and leaders are thinking about these days. But more importantly, it's something that's financially stable, a growth market, but is also mission aligned. And I think that's really important when we think about why these markets are so important, is that higher ed is really about helping people learn, gain knowledge, help them retool, think about how they might impact society, and prepare them for the future. And I think if we think about a world that is already age diverse in the workplace and in society, that it just stands to reason that we would have an age diverse university or college experience. And so I think this is just the beginning and a signal, and we can talk about it later, but I think there's more signals that are out there that are just kind of right around the corner, and people are starting to peek into it. And I think if we can put it all together, I think higher ed presidents and provosts and boards can see that this can be part of their overall strategy.
And I just add that this is a growing demographic that is underserved, and universities have the infrastructure and the expertise to help people with this stage of life. And I also think that as we think about just demographic shifts, we serve some demographics really well, but there's no reason why we couldn't serve additional demographics just as well. And this is a growth opportunity for presidents.
And I imagine we can also remind people that there's a shrinking demographic of the young, just as there's an expanding segment of the older. And so what you're both pointing to is kind of sustainability for universities is kind of anchored in aligning what they offer to the way the whole world and markets are reshaping.
Yeah, I think if I was in the shoes of a university president, I'd be thinking about exactly to your point, around the world, as you've covered in your podcast, fertility rates are dropping, right? And in the US, I think I saw that high schoolers peaked in 2025, and they're going to drop about 13% between now and 2041. So if your traditional age students are going to be declining, I think given the current environment, geopolitically, international students are a little bit constrained right now. And so to Kate's point, if you think about the fastest and the only growing market of the population is older adults. And as we've talked about in previous conversations and in your podcast, that demographic, their needs are also changing substantially as well. So it's a bit of a nice mirroring where there's a business model reason for why they need to expand that actually taps into their mission, but also there's a changing sentiment of what these individuals want. And to Kate's point, I think there's a lot which we can unpack around the capabilities and the structures that already exist on universities are already meant for these things. They're just serving a much younger population. And we can get into it. I think it's also served learning for other populations in the past that university presidents can look at as inspiration to say, we've done this already. We've just done it with different populations.
Yeah, I wanted to pick up on that because you're noting, and I think you're absolutely right, that international students may be dropping off for some universities that traditionally relied on them for a number of reasons. And you were saying that these midlife programs are a little bit like the way that universities did open up to international students. They brought fresh diversity, new perspectives, lots of long-term benefits to campus cultures. Can you share a little bit how you think generational, what you call age diverse, could reshape the university experience, not just for these midlifers who are showing up, but actually for everybody, faculty, students, administrators? Kate, you want to take that one?
Yeah. So, I can give an example. So with one of the programs that I work with, the Osher Lifelong Learning Institute, we bring people into the classroom occasionally, it's not a routine thing, but where we have intergenerational discussion. And we had a discussion around the civil rights era and how there's so many parallels between what was happening in the 60s and 70s in the US and what's happening today. And so there's just such richness in that conversation. And to Simon's point, international students bring that as well. They bring us different perspectives, different worldviews. I think you get the same kind of benefit when you bring generations together, not only to see how life may have been different, because, we often will talk about, life before the internet or just, some of those kinds of things that are pretty funny when you talk about across generations. But when you get into really meaty discussions, you find that the generations are way more similar than not. And so you also end up combating ageism when you get people together in that classroom to talk about things that matter. And I think that's one of the magic things that happens when you bring different people together with different worldviews.
I'm always struck by how much the media wants to set generations up against each other when everything we're seeing, Simon, is that put them together and things really start to happen, innovate, recreate.
Yeah, I think that some of that comes down to, I know you had Mark Friedman on in previous podcasts he talks a lot about age segregation, right? The idea that, as we, industrialize, we segregated ages by people older and younger people going to school. We had people who are, specific around ages at work. And then we obviously, from a retirement perspective, had people off in the retirement communities. I think what we're seeing now is the opportunity to bring ages back together. And I think it's very practical, right? If we think about workplaces, which I know you've done a lot on, workplaces are 5 generations now. Society is 5 generations. So if we don't have a lot of spaces anymore where generations outside of your family structure where they come together, we need more of those so people can practice being around each other and learning from each other. And to Kate's point, appreciating some of those differences. And I think higher ed is a perfect place for that to take place. So, back to the kind of the international student comment, part of the reason I think why university and colleges brought international students onto campus, was because the world was globalizing. And so it stands to reason to say, look, we need to understand how different cultures work. They have different practices, different norms. We need to learn to appreciate that if we're going to be practical about doing business abroad, et cetera. And so again, if we're going to be working in a workplace where we have older and younger together in the workplace, I think that logic, again, plays true if we're thinking about how do we help people practice and come together and appreciate each other's differences and find ways to work together on campuses well before they get into the workplace or into a multi-generational society.
And I also think when you bring people together across generations, you're bringing them together in the classroom, you're bringing them together as peers, and you're recognizing that older adults have a lot to learn from young adults and vice versa. And so it's not just a mentoring or, hierarchical relationship. You're bringing together people as peers. And when you talk about innovation, that's one of the things that is most wonderful when you bring diverse views together, where you're together working on solutions that address some of the biggest challenges we face.
And I hear a lot from the corporate and business worlds that they're desperate for talent, that there are going to be shortages, but it requires people to keep upskilling over decades in a way that they didn't necessarily do as much before. So there's a huge demand side for some of what you guys are developing. And I wanted to explore a little bit what works and what doesn't. So Kate, you led the University of Minnesota's Advanced Careers program. Super innovative, difficult to sustain. What did you learn from that experience? What worked and what made it hard?
We were still in proving concept stage when the pandemic hit. And, I think that one of the things that was very important, and we've heard this over and over again from all of the different programs that have been successful in this space, is it's important to have senior leadership on board and have a champion, have someone that can help institutionalize these kinds of programs within the institution. I know, Simon, you talked about a fringe program. I mean, these things can't be just boutique programs serving a small number of people, or we're never going to get sustainability for them. They really have to be something that is part of how leaders see their strategy of growth. And so, that strong leadership presence, that strong senior leadership support is really key. The other thing that I think is really important is finding that business model that is sustainable, because these programs have to be self-sustaining. I mean, not only to support themselves, but also to support our universities and the work that we're doing in other areas. And I think one of the challenges that we had is we were trying to develop a program that was broadening the reach of these programs to increasingly, populations that maybe aren't served with some of the existing successful programs. And so we were really wanting to make this not only a transformative experience, but also an affordable experience. And what happens with that is our margins are so slim. And so, we hadn't figured out just how to make that work and be sustainable. And so I think that senior leadership support and that business model and approach are really key to making them work. And it's hard in this space, but it's not impossible in this space. I mean, there is a lot of potential there. It's just figuring out how you're going to make the margins work.
Yeah.
I mean, I think what I see, Avivah, is that this is very similar to any larger enterprise or established organization trying to innovate, right? You've got some, entrepreneurs or, innovators inside the institution who see the vision and they start to build, but without any type of, let's call it seed capital or investment, it's really hard to get it to scale. And to Kate's point, I think that's the job to be done, which is if we think that these midlife programs are something that is part of a broader movement, we need to help presidents and provosts and boards see that broader vision. And I think it comes down to, we need to give them the data. Right. And I think, I know in your work, you constantly push data to make sure that people see the data. It's surprising the lack of awareness around some of the demographic shifts in the data that's happening. So we need to show them the data. We need to show them market signals. In other words, I think we need to show them that this is, where Kate and I spend a lot of time is on these midlife transition programs where you interviewed these directors, but that's only one cluster of innovation that's happening in higher ed. related to this field. There are university-based retirement communities, which essentially are the retirement communities that are on campuses, which we can talk about further. There's the OLLI programs. There's intergenerational learning programs. There's research that's being done on campus around on aging. There are think tanks like the Stanford Center on Longevity or the MIT Age Lab. And we need to kind of package up these clusters of innovation to help senior leaders see the connection between the data and the market signals. And then I think another important thing that we've kind of learned over the course of this is that when we show examples, because everybody wants examples, right? Everyone wants to be innovative, but they want to see examples
they
of
want
success.
Proof. Yep.
That they want proof. But when we show them the examples of successful programs that are scaling, like the Harvard ALI program that you attended or the Stanford program, a lot of the individuals in these university and campuses go, well, that's not, I can't build a Stanford program. And so what we need to emphasize is that they need to build something that's aligned to their ethos, aligned to their mission. The version of the University of Minnesota program is going to look very different than the program at, Bennington College or at Goucher College. So, the reality is I think we need to help people understand that this is a broader trend, that there are signals, but they can create the experience and the offering that actually suits their market, suits their capabilities. And I think those are the things that we need to emphasize. And to Kate's point, it needs to start from the top to get that type of investment.
And I think that's what most of my listeners won't, and most anybody who has experience of any one of these programs but doesn't have your overview of all of them, they don't really see all these differences in capability and leadership involvement. Most of what I've seen so far have been kind of passion projects from a small group of faculty that really believed in this. But higher ed has a very unusual organizational structure. And so different universities have very different ways of seeding the innovation that you're going to talk about. And generally, they got to get this kind of wide span of faculty support behind it, which some of them have more capability to do than others. So, the institutional challenge I keep hearing are going to be great, right? It's how do you scale? How do you scale with the right kind of support and input? Kate, maybe you want to just talk a little bit about the Osher Lifelong Learning Institute, because that's pretty well scaled. You're serving tens of thousands of older adults across the U.S. What are we pulling out of that example?
Yeah, so just really briefly, Osher Lifelong Learning Institute goes by OLLI at different universities, is present in 124 universities across the United States. So even though each individual OLLI is part of this network, they're all based at their university. So they all have their own personalities, kind of like the Nexel programs that we've been talking about, these programs that are in this space. I think the OLLIs are really interesting because they are embedded. Many of them existed before they actually became OLLIs as some form of outreach that their universities did with older adults and bringing education to them, enrichment learning. And I think that what's particular about the OLLIs is that the programming is targeted towards people 50 plus, mostly retired. And so the curriculum is non-credit and it's enrichment learning, but it's deep learning as well. I mean, we rely on retired faculty and experts in the field to teach these courses. And so it is an amazing learning opportunity, learning community in the universities where they exist. I do think that many of the OLLIs are also doing more on campus that is intergenerational. And so even though most of the courses of our OLLIs are based on targeting people 50 plus, they're also integrating into some of the work of the university. Like, for instance, we have a program called the OLLI Scholars Program. We hire students, graduate students, to come teach for us. And it's a way to support our graduate students, their their education and learning how to teach, and then doing it in a community that's really engaged with the learning. So we actually had a graduate student last term say that this OLLI teaching experience was was her most exciting thing that she's done in her whole graduate career. I mean, it's really good for the students and helps them build practical experience, but our learners love hearing from these newer professionals who are just curious, about what's going on, some of the cutting edge research and scholarship that's going on our campuses. We also have a Culture Corps program where we have international students come in and teach for us. Some OLLIs will have their older adults join some of the healthcare programs, some of the classes, and bring that perspective and talk to some of the students about what it's like to be an older adult. So there's so many opportunities that exist out there. And I think OLLIs are just a natural way, at least in the US, because OLLIs are just in the US, but just they exist, our campuses exist. And to Simon's point, we've got all of these pockets. We just need to kind of find ways to integrate them. And also, I do think globally, there's programs like OLLIs all across the globe. So
we keep talking about the business model and how to scale. What's the business model? What worked there?
For OLLIs?
Yeah.
Yeah, they're all a little different. So, we extensively rely on volunteers, so that keeps our costs down. So we have, for our OLLI, 3 employees and about 1,100 members. And so our members volunteer for us. They volunteer to teach for us. They have other roles for us as well. And then also people join OLLI as members. So they have membership fees.
Okay.
Our OLLI, it's a single fee, but many OLLIs have, you join and then you pay per class. So they're all using different models.
So there's one innovation, one model. Yeah. Simon, I'm just curious. Nexel has been working really hard to gather the learning from all the different kind of midlife training programs that have been spreading and growing now all globally, which is very encouraging. If we think of this as kind of an ecosystem, how would you describe the state of play? Where are we? And where are these midlife training programs in the midst of all these other innovations you're pointing to?
I think that where we are is really at the beginning. We generally are seeing programs, pilots. It's all subscale for the most part. And, I'm really glad that we kind of talked about OLLI programs, because to me, OLLI programs is one of the, I'm going to call it big ideas for higher ed. And why I use the term big idea is that actually in September, we're going to be launching something called the Big Ideas Challenge through a collaboration between CoGenerate, which is the organization that Mark Friedman, your previous guest, was on, CEO, and they're about bringing generations together, and an organization called Campus Compact, which is an organization that brings affinity groups, best practices, kind of like Nexel together. It's a MetLife funded foundation initiative. And what we want to do is profile 3 to 5 big ideas in higher ed, but like clusters, right? So kind of like an OLLI, kind of like a Nexel. And the purpose of that is to elevate, to your point, a few of these larger business models or program models within higher ed to raise awareness with the boards, presidents, and provosts of higher ed, because I think that's what they need to see. A lot of times we talk about individual programs, and I think when you're thinking, to your point, strategically, I think we need to look at these in much more of a program model way and see that there's ways to take some of these program models and actually scale it into something like an OLLI. We can scale it into something like these midlife transition programs that Nexel is trying to cultivate. You had a guest on previously, Lindsay Beagley from Arizona State University, who was talking about university-based retirement facilities that are on campus. And in her case, she has the most prominent one at Arizona State called Mirabella. But that's a cluster of innovation. There is an organization that tracks university-based retirement communities here in the U.S., and I think there's 90-plus university and colleges that have some sort of senior residence or retirement facility that's located either on campus or very proximate to campus. And the evolution of this model is that over time, what they've done is it was originally a real estate land play. But over time, what they've done is start to integrate these older adults into campus, because there was a desire by the older adults to be part of the campus fabric and community and be a student and participate in some of the intergenerational learning opportunities that Kate talked about. So you can start to see that there are these pockets of innovation, but to your point around where are we? We're really, really early right now. And so I think the job to be done is for us to help, again, higher ed leaders understand the data, understand the market opportunity and why it is mission aligned. Or as a board member at one of the colleges I just spent some time with called it has to be mission consistent, right? That it's mission consistent and that there are already these clusters of innovation that are out there that I can see. And then how do I build our own version from our institutional perspective?
I also think that it's also at the beginning for individuals realizing that, they need to navigate these new waters without a lot of roadmaps. I work with Professor Phyllis Moen, who's a life course sociologist, and she talks about, just how we need to shift some of our institutions to be more responsive to the new ways that we are navigating life today. And so, the whole idea of retirement is being redefined here. People are not necessarily working. They're certainly not working for one employer, but they're not just working and then, that retirement is just kind of that on and off shift. They are looking at new ways to work into retirement. They're looking for careers and portfolio lives, and the way we live has changed. Our institutions haven't kept pace. And so instead of looking at this as something I have to figure out individually, we need to look at how we can change society and provide some more structure and support as people are navigating the realities of how we're living today. And I think that's a really important perspective, because I think we're just coming up with this idea of just how do we help people, but it's also shifting some of the patterns that we've had over the years that are reflecting reality for today.
Yeah, well, the old kind of learn, work, retire, 3-step model is kind of dead. So I'm very interested in this. I mean, we're talking there's this whole organizational strategic side. And Kate, you're reminding us that there's the individual side. I'm curious, what are the pivot points in adult life where you think people really could use institutional support that is the university's mission critical duty, I suppose? What is it? Empty nest, post-caregiving, any career transition, just all the time? I always think, we should be going back every decade, maybe. Have we mapped that out? Has anybody done work like that?
So we just launched the Midlife Academy at the University of Minnesota as a way to address some of these pivot points that people experience at midlife and beyond. But I think midlife is a time where people are ready and wanting some change, or maybe forced into it too.
Can you define midlife for because there's a big debate. What do we call midlife? It can be very broad.
It is very broad. And I think just generally you're going to hear 45 to 65. And, the people are not exact with this, because I think it's also, where you're at in your life course. I mean, Mark Friedman has talked about, getting an AARP discount on a hotel and also needing a crib. So, our life stages don't necessarily follow that lockstep, right? But, we know that people in those middle career times oftentimes are ready to make some career shifts. They're often adjusting to family shifts. We've talked about the sandwich generation of people who are caring for children as they're growing up, but then also older adults, and they're kind of in this middle stage. If you've had children, when your children leave for college or they leave the house, then it is this whole identity shift that happens of, okay, so much of my life is spent caring for these people, these little people, these growing people, and these older adult people. What do I want now? It's new chapters open up and people aren't sure what to do with those chapters. I would also say too, for a lot of people in those middle years, they're realizing that maybe their work doesn't work for them anymore, and they really need new ways to work. And so that's another pivot point. I also think that, health issues may shift things, and sometimes you see that in those middle years where, maybe people can't work the same way they worked, so they need to find more sustainable work. And then also, I think as people approach those traditional retirement years, there's a lot of pivots that happen with that. I think that is one of the places where I think a lot of these programs are really serving people well, to try to figure out what is it that they want in this next chapter of their lives. Yep. And so looking at, how do I continue to work in some capacity, whether it's paid or unpaid, but that meaningful contribution, that meaningful work being part of what that plan is. Where do I want to live? How do I want to navigate this? And, for many of us, it's a process. We can't just jump into what's next and always get it right. We know a lot more about what we don't like than what we do like. And so we have to get some space and time to think as well as to experiment. And doing that in a community really can make all the difference in the world.
Yep.
I think your point about coming back every 10 years, I think it's a really interesting one because, when I started down this space, a lot of the obvious places were the ones that Kate talked about around, empty nest, post-caregiving, midlife, et cetera. But if you start thinking about pivots as things where there's a shift in identity or a shift in the amount of time that you have or a shift in purpose, you start looking at, audiences that I never even had thought about. Professional athletes, right? I know I was talking to a couple of executive directors of the midlife programs. They have former professional athletes that are in their programs because they retire very early, right? And they've got to figure out what they're going to do with the rest of their life. And that is a very similar stage to the folks that are in these traditional midlife programs. People who sell businesses, right? I was talking to a venture capital firm, private equity firm that buys up traditional businesses where they're doing a transition. And they've created programs called former owners programs for these individuals who their whole life was building up this plumbing business. And so, it's a family business. They don't want to do it anymore. And so they have to figure out what's next. And so a lot of the challenges was holding on to it. How do they help them? So again, is there a partnership that could happen with higher ed for some of these audiences? Military, right? I think that if we go back to the GI Bill back in the 40s, military folks have a transition to make. And how do we, again, help them with shifting their identity, time, and purpose? So I think when we expand this to look at it across ages, I think there's a lot of different opportunities. It's, to your point, finding out where those are in the life course and being there to indicate that, look, we're not living this linear 3-stage life anymore. It's much more multi-stage. In the Stanford Center on Longevity, one of the lines they have, which I love, is they talk about how transitions are more of a feature, not a bug anymore, right? That part of life, we're going to have all these transitions. So how could higher ed be there to help people navigate these transitions? And could we do it in a way that's as a blended community by ages? Because I think there's so much lived experience, as well as different perspectives when we blend those ages together as people think about what they want to do next and how they want to learn moving forward.
Yeah, no, I think that whole idea, the multiplicity, that we all have to become super skilled at transitions, and the young even more. I mean, we had a few changes. I think those are going to multiply, as you say. So, Simon, you're talking a lot about the employer side. So let's go back to our old ecosystem. And what do we think of companies and businesses? Are they playing a role? We've talked about midternships, employer partnerships. How much are they playing a role in creating real life bridges for all the wonderful people we're going to hopefully get through these new and innovative midlife programs? Are they there? Are they ready?
I think to your question about, innovation maturity, again, it's still pretty early. There are returnship programs and internship programs that have started. I know Goldman Sachs created a returnship program for people who had been out of the workforce for a while that were targeted at midlife women, which is great. But I think there's a whole ecosystem to be built. And I'm from Canada and I live in Kitchener-Waterloo, Ontario. One of the universities here is the University of Waterloo, which is world-renowned for its work integrated learning and co-op program, which for those who aren't familiar with it is for traditional age students, it's going to school for 4 months in whatever discipline you're teaching. You work for 4 months and then you go to school for 4 months and you kind of alternate. And there's the university itself.
I did that. That's how I got my first job with IB.
There you go, right?
A million years ago.
That's right. That's right. So there's a model already in higher ed, across higher ed, where you have higher ed partnering with workplaces. The point is to help learners get a sense of what the workplace looks like and the workplace benefits, because they get early access to talent, to test it out, to maybe de-risk some of the talent that they're getting in there. It's a new pipeline for them, and they get to understand the culture of the workplace. So there's a really nice symbiotic relationship. And this is back to scaled models. This is a massively scaled model in traditional undergraduate learning. And so I think, again, if we were to apply, again, not maybe that exact model, but a model like that for midlife and older adult learners, it might be a great way after they've been through a midlife program like a Harvard ALI or a Stanford DCI or a midlife academy, where there actually is an opportunity to try short placements could be paid opportunities, could be volunteer opportunities, et cetera. And again, it's a way to build those connections between the workplace, and the institution. And then also by bringing in these additional applied avenues to opportunities post-program, I think, again, there's a real interesting opportunity to create more intergenerational learning opportunities with older and younger working with some of these workplaces, right? If you think about some of the workplace challenges that they're facing right now, whether it be AI transformation or climate or whatever, wouldn't it be really interesting to bring older and younger who are interested in those particular areas and actually have them work on tangible workplace problems while as part of their learning experience, right? And so again, I think there's a lot of opportunity to explore how can we leverage workplace partnerships, but again, in this intergenerational and this multi-generational way. The models are there. It's how do we innovatively adapt them for this new age diversity and this new demographic reality?
With the University of Minnesota Advanced Careers Initiative, I mean, one of our cornerstones was a midternship or internship midlife, right? So what we did is we helped people learn about some of the issues they care about and then place them with a nonprofit where they worked on a project. And, there's so many barriers when people are trying to make a career change into a new industry, and one of them being not having practical experience. So what this did was it opened up some opportunity for people to come with practical experience to reinvent themselves. Also, most of them were reporting into someone, 20 years younger than them. So it was just, they're demonstrating, yes, I can work for a younger boss, and yes, I can take my, let's say, corporate experience and apply it in a different way in a nonprofit. And so it smoothed some of the expectations that employers were looking for someone who may be shifting fields. And I also think too, we did have a couple of fellows that had stopped out of the workplace because they had caregiving. Mostly, it was caregiving experiences, and we're ready to get back into the workplace, but that is really a hard process for people. We have still so many stigmas around being out of the workplace. And so what happened with that program is, and this is true for those returnships as well, it creates work experience that is recent and relevant to the direction they're going so that their resume includes that. Yeah. And I think one of the points that we need to make with employers is the talent's there. These people bring, years of experience that is needed in the workplace. Maybe we can help make them update some of, their experiences so that they're more appealing. But I think employers need to look at them as a talent base and not, people that have just not, some of the stereotypes that go with people who may have been unemployed for a little bit of time.
Okay, I think you guys have made the case. There's demographics, there's purpose, there's talent, there's lots of innovation around. I want to talk about two things to conclude: funding and where we're headed, the future. Who should be paying for midlife learning? Individuals, employers, governments, some combination. Mark Friedman's calling for a new GI Bill. What new models are we going to see? Subscriptions, lifelong alumni memberships, learning accounts. What are you guys dreaming might make it both viable and equitable?
Well, I think the answer is all three. I think everybody has to have a stake in the game. So I do think that there is a need for government funding. If the government looks at, public health as a social good, learning would be the same thing, right? And I think we're seeing some of those models already in other parts of the world. So, I know you're quite familiar with Singapore, Avivah, but the Skills Future credits in Singapore are an example of Singapore government setting aside dollars to help people learn not later in life, but across the life course. So I think there's an opportunity for government to step in. I think we're going to see organizations also think about this maybe from a benefits standpoint. So lifelong learning accounts, I think, are something that we should be considering. I know it's been talked about at the Aspen Institute, talking about, we have in the U.S. 401k, accounts for retirement. Should we not have something similar if we're going to need learning across the life course? And if you take a kind of a retirement, account model, maybe it's a matching process. Maybe it's I put in, $500 or $1,000 and my employer puts in $500 to $1,000. to help match my ongoing learning. And then I think, the universities and colleges need to look at their business models, their revenue models. Maybe there are subscription models where someone actually signs on and subscribes to have access to a certain suite of programs for a specific purpose. And that allows them to pick courses and pick programs that make sense for them. So I think, again, back to, we've done this before, right? If you look at traditional age students, 18 to 22, there's structures in place to help them. University and colleges know where to find them. They're in high schools, right? For midlife and older adults, university and colleges need to figure out what are the new watering holes for that audience, right? And we've talked about a few of these around the different touch points across the life course, right? We've found funding models to help subsidize and help people be able to afford some of this education. We need to build programs that fit the audience and fit the institution and affordability. And to your point, we need pathways, right? So I think the funding is each party, but I think we can look at models that exist already and figure out what are ways to adapt that to this new audience.
And I think employers need to pay a big part of this as well, in part because they're looking for talent. And so how do we help them get access to talent who's ready for those kinds of experiences? Like, for instance, we had a nonprofit here that worked with older adults in memory care and nursing homes. They were having such a hard time getting skilled nurses to work for them. In part because I think, there's so many opportunities and demand for skilled nurses. So what they did is they looked at the structure of the job and they changed it up so that it was more appealing for people. Even though they weren't able to compete on pay, they made the jobs more flexible and less hours, but still benefits. So they kind of looked at how they structured their work. I think that's going to be one of the next waves, is looking at how we structure work. And then there's also some innovative programs. The Encore Fellowships comes to mind for me too. So there's employers, but I'll mention Intel and HP, who created pathways for people to transition out of their organizations and work with nonprofits. And so they had a midternship kind of experience with a nonprofit. And they supported it. They cobbled together creatively the different benefits that they had, their learning accounts that, supporting some of their professional development and, benefits, the way that they could structure benefits so that they were able to help people bridge. And they found that it was also really good for PR for their brands in those communities. So I think there's so much room for innovation here, and we're going to see a lot of experimentation on the employer side of it, and just understanding, what is the benefit to the employer, and that's got to be the big piece of the message.
What I like in both of what you're saying is that a lot of these systems already exist for a variety of populations. It just hasn't been focused at all on flexibilizing and incentivizing older people, and even imagining that they might and could work differently than earlier. So, to conclude, let me project you both maybe a decade hence. And if universities fully embrace this whole longevity revolution, what would this dream life course campus look like? How would people experience education from, 18 to 80, if you guys had your way?
I think we'd have such a wonderful relationship with people across the lifespan that when they're at a pivot point, they would think first of a university. I need a new skill. We know that, people say, I need a 4-year degree. I want a 4-year degree. I'm going to go to a university. We want them to think about, I need to upskill. I need to develop some new, expertise. I'm going to go get a certificate. We're working in some of these spaces, but also to say, we're going to help you figure it out. And guess what? We have programs that are going to align with what you're looking for if that's what you need. So I think these midlife programs help people not only kind of identify a new identity and, figure out what they want, but it's also like, how do I take the next step? And universities, we can funnel people into these kinds of opportunities that already exist on our campuses. So I want people to think about us first. And they can find a place where they can help figure it out. They can find that same place where they can help reskill or upskill. And then they can also find those midternship opportunities where they can develop the practical skills. And universities can do all of this.
Yep.
Three things come to mind. I think I would love to see in 10 years a campus where people of all ages are living together. And I mean, living could be from a, residential standpoint, but just proximally together in the same space. I think the second one is they're learning together in intergenerational classrooms, in intergenerational spaces, in clubs, in civic engagement. They're finding ways to learn together across the generations. I don't have another L, but I think transitions. I think we have people transitioning together. It's a hub for transitions. And to your point, and Kate's point about the fact that when you think about a shift in identity, a shift in your time, a shift in your purpose, that higher ed, this place, 10 years from now, is a place that you would think about to come back to be able to transition to what's next. And because there's a community there of people at the same stage who are wanting to learn and wanting to continue to grow and reinvent themselves. And that's, 10 years is in university terms is a short period of time, but I think we can do it. I think there's an imperative to do it given the demographic shifts that's happening in the next 10 years. And also, quite frankly, the business model challenges and funding challenges that university and colleges are facing today that I think we're at an inflection point where I think this is the time to look at this.
Yes, I think they can either listen to this and wait a decade until they have no choice, or get a little bit ahead of the game and listen to this and get really active. There's huge, massive opportunity. I can't agree with you more. So maybe just one last takeaway for all, if any, university leaders listening to this. What's one message you want them to take away?
I have sat on a university board, and I know that longevity and demographics is on the list, but it's usually on the enterprise risk management list. And I think the takeaway is let's move it away from your enterprise risk management list. You need to keep it on there and monitor it, of course. But how do we flip it over to your innovation, growth, and strategy list? How do we take it and think about the opportunities associated with it, not just the risks that come with an aging and age-diverse population?
And I'm going to just add to that too, that, look towards the opportunity here. And, we've spent so much time worrying about, that demographic cliff of, the number of 18 to 22-year-olds that are just dropping off. And instead look at, we've got growing demographics that need us. And there's so much potential. And we are going to have to shift how we do things and provide some support for people as they're looking at, it may look a little different from what we're doing with 18 to 22-year-olds, but we have the resources, we have the infrastructure, the potential is there. So just think a little differently.
Kate Schaefers and Simon Chen, thank you so much for sharing with us. I think I have really picked up that universities are at an inflection point. This is a fantastic moment that could be either full of opportunity or full of threats, depending how you look at it. And really, it's just a question of innovation and focusing on how can we, I love your phrase of how can we stay mission critical, but just widen the aperture of the populations we serve. So thank you so much. I hope they're listening, and I'll meet you back here in 10 years to see which ones have shifted.
Thank you so much for this opportunity.
Thanks, Avivah. Love the conversation.
Thanks, you guys. See you soon. For more thinking about the impact of our 4-quarter lives, you can read my column at Forbes and subscribe to my Elderberries newsletter on Substack. Let's design lives that aren't just longer, but better.